Before dawn broke on Christmas morning, the plantation stood exactly as it had the night before, rows of cabins hushed under cold air, the main house still glowing with the comfort of wealth, and iron chains hanging where they were always meant to hang. But as the sun slowly climbed, something impossible became clear. The quarters were empty. Not one voice rose in song or prayer. Not one footstep stirred the frozen ground. More than 300 enslaved men, women, and children had vanished without a struggle, without blood, without warning. Their shackles lay open on the dirt floors, collars abandoned, links snapped or carefully unfastened, as if bondage itself had been quietly set down and walked away from. No alarm had been raised in the night, no dogs had barked, no overseer had fired a shot. The river nearby showed no bodies, the roads no tracks, the forests no clear trail. For a system built on total control, this was an unthinkable failure. Plantation owners called it an act of madness. Newspapers whispered of rebellion. Some swore it was divine punishment for celebrating Christmas while holding human beings in chains. Others claimed the slaves had planned it for years, waiting for the one night when guards would be distracted by drink, prayer, and false peace. But the most unsettling detail was not that 300 people escaped. It was how they did it together, in silence, on the one day meant to symbolize mercy and birth. Whatever happened on that plantation was not chaos. It was not panic. It was something organized, something shared, something powerful enough to make an entire system wake up on Christmas Day to nothing but empty cabins and cold iron left behind. The plantation was known across the county not for mercy or prosperity but for discipline so tight it felt like a second skin. Travelers spoke of it in lowered voices, wagon drivers adjusted their pace when passing its gates, and neighboring planters measured their own authority against it with a mix of admiration and unease. Control was not simply enforced there, it was engineered. Every path, every cabin, every stretch of field had been designed to limit movement and crush unpredictability. The owner believed chaos was the enemy of profit, and freedom, even imagined freedom, was a form of chaos that had to be strangled before it could breathe. From sunrise to nightfall, eyes were everywhere. Overseers rotated shifts so no hour passed without supervision. If one man watched the fields, another lingered near the quarters. If someone claimed illness, someone else came to confirm it. Lanterns burned long after dusk, casting long shadows across the dirt that made it impossible to step outside without being seen. Even silence was monitored. A laugh at the wrong hour, a whispered conversation held too long could bring punishment sharp enough to echo through the cabins as a warning to the rest. The enslaved people learned early that privacy did not exist. Cabins were searched without notice. Sleeping spaces were inspected for hidden tools, scraps of paper, or anything that hinted at planning. Food rations were counted. Work tools were locked away each night. Chains were not just restraints but symbols, worn or kept close, reminding everyone that movement was permitted only by permission. The plantation prided itself on never losing a laborer, not to escape, not to rebellion, not even to rumor. Other estates had stories of runaway. This one claimed immunity. Dogs were trained not merely to track but to intimidate. Their presence alone kept hearts racing. They were paraded during inspections, leashes tight, teeth bared. Handlers eager to show what would happen to anyone foolish enough to test the boundary. Patrol routes were varied intentionally, so patterns could not be learned easily. Fences were repaired obsessively, even when they were not strictly necessary, because the sight of barriers mattered as much as their function. Control here was psychological before it was physical. The overseers themselves were chosen for loyalty over kindness. Many had served on multiple plantations, building reputations for breaking resistance. They kept written records of behavior, noting who spoke too freely, who walked too slowly, who showed signs of leadership among the others. Those marked as influential were separated, assigned different work crews, or placed under closer watch. The goal was isolation. Unity frightened the management more than exhaustion ever could. Religious gatherings were allowed but tightly regulated. Sermons were prayer meetings were timed. Even moments meant for spiritual comfort became opportunities for surveillance. The owner believed belief could be useful if controlled, dangerous if allowed to wander. Songs were listened to carefully, lyrics examined for hidden meaning. A hymn sung too softly or too fiercely could be questioned. Faith was permitted only insofar as it reinforced obedience. Christmas, ironically, was part of the control. It was advertised as a kindness, a brief loosening of the grip, extra food, a few hours of rest, the illusion of generosity. But even then the watch never truly stopped. The owner believed predictability was power, and holidays were predictable. People were easier to manage when they were told when they could breathe. Any gesture of leniency was calculated, designed to reinforce dependence rather than reduce. Punishments were public. Whippings were performed where others could see. Shackles were applied slowly, deliberately, so the weight of iron could be felt not just by the wearer but by every watching eye. The message was simple and repeated endlessly. Escape was impossible. Resistance was futile. Survival depended on submission. Over time, that message seeped into daily rhythm, into posture, into speech. Even children learned where they could stand, how loudly they could speak, how quickly they must look away. The plantation's reputation grew stronger with each passing year. Inspectors commented on its order. Visitors remarked on the quiet efficiency of its labor. Profits rose, reinforcing the belief that control worked. The owner boasted that fear, properly maintained, was more reliable than walls. He believed he understood human behavior completely, that desperation could be mapped and neutralized, that hope itself could be starved into extinction. And yet, beneath that surface of absolute authority, something else existed, unseen by ledgers and patrols. The same system that watched everything assumed it already knew everything. It dismissed silence as submission. It mistook compliance for loyalty. It believed that because no one ran, no one dreamed of running, control became so total that imagination itself was underestimated. And the plantation, so proud of its vigilance, never considered that the very weight of its surveillance might be forging something stronger than fear, something patient enough to wait, quiet enough to remain invisible, and disciplined enough to move only when the moment was perfect. Christmas Day altered the plantation's rhythm in ways that seemed harmless, even humane. But those subtle shifts created gaps no one in authority believed could be exploited. From the first light of morning, routine softened, work bells rang later than usual, fields remained untouched for hours that would normally be filled with forced labor. The air carried a false sense of pause, a single day when the machinery of control pretended to slow, and that pretense mattered more than anyone realized. Overseers who ruled the days with iron voices allowed themselves indulge. Some drank before noon, celebrating the holiday as a reward for their own discipline throughout the year. Others retreated to the main house, drawn by promises of heavy meals and shared laughter. Patrols still existed, but they lost their edge. Routes became shorter, checks were rough. A man who would normally inspect every corner settled for a glance, a gate left untested, a fence not examined closely, a count performed from habit rather than certainty. The owner encouraged this atmosphere. Christmas was meant to display benevolence. A performance staged as proof that the system was not cruel, but paternal. Extra rations were distributed under watchful eyes, reinforcing dependence while projecting kindness. Enslaved people were permitted to gather more freely than usual, to sing approved hymns, to share food, to sit without immediate demand. These gatherings were intended as release valves, moments that would reduce tension and renew obedience. What the owner failed to understand was that increased proximity also allowed whispered coordination, shared looks, and confirmation of plans long held in silence. Church services played a central role. Attendance was mandatory, and the focus of authority shifted inward, towards sermons and rich. Overseers stationed themselves near entrances rather than roaming the grounds, their attention fixed on decorum, on whether heads bowed at the proper moments, on whether voices rose in acceptable harmony. Outside, cabins stood unwatched longer than on any other. Paths between quarters, normally monitored, lay open under the assumption that no one would dare disrupt a holy morning. Dogs were kenneled more often than not. Handlers believed the noise would interfere with services and celebration. The animals were fed well and kept restrained, their absence alone changing the emotional temperature of the plantation. Without the constant threat of barking and pursuit, movement felt different. Steps were taken with less panic, breaths drawn a little deep. Guards trusted the holiday to keep people close, assuming no one would risk punishment on a day associated with gifts and rest. Meals at the main house stretched for hours, wine flowed, conversations turned inward, away from management and toward family, memories and self-congratulation. The enslaved population became background scenery to the overseer's sense of occasion. Watches were delayed, shift changes grew sloppy, names were checked off lists without faces being fully seen. Familiarity bred assumption, and assumption replaced verification. Nightfall on Christmas carried its own distortions. Fires burned longer, music drifted, laughter blurred the edges of vigilance. Lanterns were lit more for ambiance than surveillance, casting warm pools of light that created shadows rather than clarity. Guards congregated instead of spreading out, drawn together by cold and drink. The belief that Christmas itself discouraged rebellion was deeply ingrained. It was thought to be a day of gratitude, even among those who had no reason to feel. Children of the plantation owner roamed more freely, distracting staff. Guests arrived and departed, creating additional noise and confusion. Wagons moved in and out without the usual scrutiny, Footsteps became harder to distinguish. The soundscape changed, and with it the ability to notice what did not belong. Normal alarms were swallowed by celebration, by the assumption that any unusual sound was part of the holiday. Even the enslaved were expected to perform happiness. Songs were encouraged, smiles noted with approval. That performance masked intent. Singing became cover, laughter became camouflage. A group moving together could be dismissed as celebration rather than coordination. Packages carried were assumed to be food or gifts, not supply. The routines of kindness were so rare that they disarmed suspicion entirely. The overseers believed that fear returned automatically with sunrise, that one soft day could not unravel years of discipline. They failed to see that discipline itself had trained patience, that endurance, sharpened by suffering, could wait for the one day when eyes looked elsewhere. Christmas did not remove control, it rearranged it, stacking attention in predictable places, and leaving other spaces briefly unguarded. By the time midnight passed, the plantation was quieter than it had been all year, not because of order, but because attention had narrowed. Guards dozed, watches overlapped or were skipped. Countless small permissions added together formed an opening large enough to step through. An opening created not by rebellion in the moment, but by routine itself, by the belief that tradition could never be turned against the power that created it, by the certainty that Christmas belonged to the masters and therefore could never be claimed by those who had learned to read every weakness hidden inside generosity. The coordination did not begin on Christmas Day, nor even in the weeks leading up to it. It was the result of years spent learning one another's silences, understanding which pauses meant fear and which meant resolve. On a plantation where speaking openly could mean punishment, communication adapted. A glance held half a second longer than normal, a tool placed deliberately out of line, a song verse repeated when it did not need to be. These became signals. Trust was built slowly, not through grand declarations but through shared survival, through watching who endured without betraying others, who listened more than they spoke, who remembered names even when families were torn apart. Men and women who worked in different fields learned to recognize one another's rhythms. A water break aligned with another crew's rest. A walk to the tool shed passed close enough for fingers to brush. Children carried messages no overseer thought to decode, repeating phrases that sounded like play but carried instruction. Elders, long dismissed as broken by labor, held memories of paths, rivers, stars and seasons, storing knowledge that had no place in written record. Every person had a role, not assigned loudly but accepted quietly. The silence was the most dangerous part. Plans were never spoken in full, not even among those most trusted. Each person knew only what they needed to know. One group understood timing, another memorized, another gathered supplies in fragments too small to raise suspicion. A blanket here, a bit of food there, a tool hidden beneath loose boards, nothing that could be discovered in one search, nothing that pointed to a larger picture. If questioned, no single individual could betray the whole because the whole existed only when everyone moved together. Night after night, small rehearsals happened without appearing like rehearsals. Someone would walk a path and count steps. Someone else would test how long it took a lantern to pass from one point to another. Children played games that mirrored movement patterns. Songs were sung that matched walking pace. Prayer meetings doubled as timing exercises, learning how long voices could rise before attention. Even fear became useful, sharpening awareness rather than breaking it. The greatest challenge was not movement, but unity. 300 people did not think or feel as one, yet they learned to act as one. Disagreements existed, fears clashed, doubts surfaced, but those conversations happened in fragments, absorbed into the larger necessity. No one was promised safety, no one was guaranteed reunion. The only certainty was that staying meant continuing the same suffering, generation after generation. That understanding did not need to be explained. It lived in scars, in missing names, in memories of children sold away. Women coordinated as much as men, often more. Their access to domestic spaces allowed information to flow. They saw who drank too much, who slept too deeply, who argued with whom. They noted when dogs were restless or calm. They observed which overseers trusted routine blindly. Their labor brought them near the main house, near discarded scraps of conversation, near schedules left unattended. What appeared as invisibility became advantage. Children were instructed carefully, not with threats but with seriousness. They were told when to be quiet, when to move, when to follow without asking why. Many did not fully understand the scale of what was coming, only that they must stay close and listen. Their ability to pass unnoticed made them essential. Their small hands carried small things that together mattered greatly. As Christmas approached, tension increased, but outwardly nothing changed. Work continued.
Songs continued, punishments continued. The plantation saw what it expected to see. Those coordinating learned to control their expressions, to appear no different than the day before. The discipline forced upon them was turned inward, used to maintain composure under pressure. Panic was the enemy. Speed was less important than precision. On the night itself, there were no shouted commands. Movement began as if it were coincidence. One cabin emptied slowly, another followed minutes later. Paths crossed at points chosen long in advance. People walked in lines that blended into darkness, close enough to stay together, far enough to avoid noise. Hands reached for hands without words. Those who stumbled were lifted. Those who froze were guided forward. No one was left to decide alone. The silence was intentional, almost sacred. Not a prayer spoken aloud, not a cry, not even the sound of chains, because chains had been dealt with earlier, loosened, unlocked, or abandoned entirely. What remained was the sound of breathing, the soft crunch of earth, the awareness of bodies moving with shared purpose. The plantation built to fracture unity, watched unknowingly as unity passed through it intact. There were moments when everything could have collapsed. A lantern flared unexpectedly. A voice called out in the distance. A dog shifted in its sleep. Each time movement paused as one, then resumed. The decision made without discussion. Trust carried them forward. Trust earned through years of watching one another, and by the time the last person left the quarters, the space they had occupied all their lives stood unchanged, except for the absence of life within it. The coordination did not end at the gates. It continued beyond, reshaping itself as paths diverged, as groups split according to plan, as some led and others followed, as the shared silence carried them away from the only world they had known, bound not by chains now but by an agreement forged in suffering, patience, and the unspoken understanding that freedom, if it came at all, would come because everyone moved together.
The chains were supposed to be permanent, as much a part of the plantation as the soil itself. Iron collars hung in cabins like tools, stacked and labeled, waiting for the next reminder of authority. Shackles lay near doorways, heavy and cold, designed not only to restrain bodies but to occupy the mind with weight and inevitability. Every link had been forged to announce ownership, to turn flesh into property, to ensure that even in rest the idea of escape felt impossible. On ordinary mornings, those chains were counted, checked, fastened with routine efficiency, the sound of metal against metal reinforcing the order of things. When dawn broke after Christmas night, the first thing the overseers noticed was not the absence of people, but the presence of iron, where people should have been. Shackles lay open on cabin floors, their locks unbroken. Collars rested against walls, carefully removed rather than ripped away. Chains were coiled neatly in places where bodies had slept only hours before. It was as if the plantation itself had been stripped of its symbols, leaving behind relics that suddenly felt powerless without the human suffering meant to complete them. Some restraints had been loosened days earlier, disguised as routine adjustments. A pin removed here, a hinge weakened there, nothing dramatic enough to invite suspicion. Others had been unlocked with keys that should never have left an overseer's belt. How those keys were accessed became a question no one could answer clearly. Domestic spaces, laundry rooms, kitchens, moments when authority assumed proximity meant loyalty, all provided opportunities unseen. The iron did not resist because it had already been defeated quietly, patiently. In several cabins, chains were found arranged deliberately, not scattered in haste. This order disturbed the overseers more than broken locks would have. It suggested intention rather than panic, dignity rather than chaos. These were not the marks of a desperate flight under pursuit. They were signs of preparation, of people who had decided when and how they would remove the final proof of their captivity. The iron had not been thrown aside in rage but set down as something no longer needed. The absence of damage was itself unsettling. No blood stained the floor, no splintered doors testified to force. The chains were intact, usable, as if waiting for hands that would never return. This challenged the overseers' understanding of power. They had believed that violence was the only language capable of breaking restraint, that iron yielded only to iron. Instead, restraint had been undone through knowledge, timing, and shared resolve. For the enslaved, those chains carried memories heavier than their weight. They remembered the first time cold metal touched skin, the shock of its chill, the way it forced posture into submission. They remembered the sound it made when dragged across dirt, announcing punishment before it arrived. To remove a chain was never just a physical act. It was an emotional one, requiring control to keep hands steady, to keep breath quiet, to keep fear from turning into noise. Each unclasped shackle marked a moment where terror was confronted and contained. Some chains were left hanging on walls where children had traced their fingers along the links countless times, learning early what awaited disobedience. Others were placed on beds as if to show they no longer belonged on bodies. The decision to leave them behind was deliberate. Carrying iron would slow movement, create sound, increase risk. But more than that, leaving chains was a statement, even if no one intended it as such. It meant the plantation could keep its iron, but not the people it claimed to bind. Overseers moved from cabin to cabin, lifting chains, testing their weight as if to confirm they were real. The familiar reassurance of iron no longer comforted them. Without bodies inside, the restraints looked strangely useless, almost absurd. The tools of domination required submission to function, and submission was gone. What remained were artifacts, stripped of meaning by absence. The plantation owner later ordered inventories taken, counting every collar, every shackle, every length of chain. The numbers matched the ledgers. Nothing had been stolen. This fact became another source of unease. Escape usually meant theft of tools, weapons, supply. Here, the enslaved had taken only themselves. The iron economy of control remained intact, yet it had failed completely. Some overseers speculated that the chains had been left as mockery. Others insisted it was evidence of outside assistance, that no group would abandon restraints without guidance or protection. Few could accept that the people they had controlled for years had chosen, together, to step away from the symbols of their bondage with nothing but resolve to guide them. The chains forced those in power to confront a possibility they had denied, that obedience had never been acceptance. For the enslaved, walking away from chains meant walking into uncertainty without the weight they had known all their lives. The absence of iron felt unfamiliar, almost dangerous at first. Limbs moved differently. Steps felt lighter but also exposed. The body had to relearn itself without restraint, even as the mind remained alert to pursue. Leaving chains behind did not erase fear, but it transformed it, shifting it from constant oppression to focused vigilance. Those abandoned restraints became the only witnesses left behind. They told no clear story, only fragments. Open locks suggested knowledge, unbroken links suggested patience, neatly placed collars suggested intention. The plantation tried to read these signs, but meaning slipped away because meaning belonged to those who had left, not those who remained. In the days that followed, chains were gathered and stored again, returned to their places as if order could be restored through repetition. But something had changed irreversibly. Iron that once symbolized certainty now symbolized failure. Every clink echoed differently. Every lock reminded the overseers that restraint depended on compliance, and compliance could disappear in silence. The empty cabins held the smell of iron longer than they held the memory of voices. Rust marked floors where chains had rested for years. Sunlight fell across metal with no one to flinch beneath it. The plantation stood full of restraints and empty of people, surrounded by the quiet evidence that chains alone could not hold those who had learned when to let them go. The absence of struggle was the detail that unsettled everyone who came searching afterward. They expected broken doors, overturned furniture, marks of resistance etched into wood and earth. Instead, the plantation looked as though life had simply paused, and then chosen not to resume. Cabins stood intact, beds were undisturbed, tools rested where they had been left. There were no signs of forced confrontation, no splintered locks, no blood-staining thresholds. The silence did not feel fresh or chaotic. It felt deliberate. Searchers moved carefully at first, assuming they had not yet reached the site of violence. They checked door frames for scratches, floors for drag marks, walls for impact. Nothing appeared. Even areas where punishment usually took place showed no indication of recent conflict. The usual traces of pain were absent, and that absence made the space feel wrong, as if the plantation itself was holding its breath. On most plantations, escape attempts left evidence behind: a snapped chain, a hurried footprint, a dropped tool. Panic always left mark. Here, panic seemed to have been excluded entirely. The ground outside the quarters showed no churned earth from running feet. Paths were visible but orderly, suggesting walking rather than flight. Grass lay pressed gently, not trampled. Whoever left did so with control, not haste. Overseers struggled to reconcile what they saw with what they believed. They assumed resistance required violence, that freedom could only be seized through struggle. The idea that hundreds of people could leave without confrontation challenged everything they understood about power. They questioned each other repeatedly, convinced something had been missed. A fight had to have happened somewhere. Someone must have resisted. Someone must have screamed, yet no evidence supported those assumptions. Inside the cabins, personal items remained. Cups sat where they had been set down.
Blankets lay folded or spread as they had been the night before. The lack of disorder suggested preparation, not interruption. Meals had not been abandoned mid-bite. There were no overturned stools or signs of sudden alarm. It appeared that people had stood up, gathered what they needed, and walked out calmly. The lack of struggle also meant there had been no immediate confrontation with authority. No overseer had been overpowered. No guard had been attacked. No weapon had been seized in a fight. This raised troubling questions about awareness. Had those in charge been bypassed entirely, or had they been present but unchallenged, their authority rendered irrelevant by timing and coordination? Either possibility undermined the belief that control was always visible and enforced. Even the dogs bore no marks of conflict, no broken chains, no signs of injury. They had not been fought or silenced violently. Their absence from the scene spoke to planning rather than desperation. Everything pointed to a departure designed to avoid detection, rather than overcome resistance, to pass through the plantation like a shadow rather than a storm. The plantation owner arrived later in the day expecting evidence of rebellion. What he found instead was order without people. The scene did not fit the narrative he needed to believe. Rebellion justified retaliation. Disorder justified punishment. Silence offered no such justification. Without struggle, there was no clear enemy action to respond to, only a failure of control that could not be blamed on chaos. The absence of blood was particularly disturbing. Blood told stories. It explained loss. It allowed events to be framed as violent necessity. Here, there was nothing to point to, nothing to display as proof of criminality. The escaped had not shed blood, and that restraint stripped the authorities of moral cover. It suggested discipline, not just in planning but in execution, a refusal to create the very evidence that would be used against them. Search parties expanded outward, convinced that signs would appear beyond the plantation. They scoured roads and forests, expecting to find the chaos somewhere else. But even there, evidence was scarce. Trails faded quickly. Footprints were light. Streams showed no disturbance. The lack of struggle seemed to extend beyond the plantation's borders, as if calm had moved with those who left. Some speculated that the escapees had been assisted by outsiders who ensured quiet passage. Others argued that such assistance would have left signs of coordination, of meetings, of supply transfers, yet nothing pointed clearly in that direction either. The simplicity of the departure suggested self-reliance, a collective decision to move without confrontation. For those left behind, the clean absence became a source of fear. If people could leave without struggle, then surveillance had not failed through force but through assumption. It meant that power had been avoided rather than challenged, rendered ineffective by silence. The plantation had been outmaneuvered, not overpowered. The lack of struggle also spoke to trust among the escapees. Violence often erupts when fear overwhelms coordination. That fear had been managed. People had trusted one another enough to move quietly, to suppress instinctive reactions, to maintain discipline, under immense pressure. Such restraint did not come from passivity, but from resolve. Officials attempted to reconstruct events through imagination, adding conflict where none existed. Reports hinted at scuffles that no one could verify. Rumors of resistance circulated despite the absence of proof. It was easier to believe in invisible violence than to accept that control had dissolved without a fight. As days passed, the plantation returned to its routines, but unease lingered. The memory of empty cabins without signs of struggle haunted those responsible for maintaining order. They replayed the scene repeatedly, searching for meaning in its calmness. Violence would have been understandable. Silence was. The absence of struggle became its own kind of statement, one that could not be easily erased or punished. It suggested that power depended not on chains or weapons but on consent extracted through fear, and that fear, once managed, could be set aside without a blow struck. The plantation remained intact, its structures unchanged, yet something essential had slipped through its grasp without resistance, without noise, without leaving behind the marks that authority relied upon to explain its own existence. On a plantation where noise often meant punishment, sound had always been a tool of control. The bark of dogs cut through night air like a warning bell. A shouted order could freeze movement instantly. A single gunshot carried far beyond the fields, a reminder that authority was never distant. These sounds formed an invisible fence, conditioning everyone to associate noise with danger, and silence with survival. That is why the complete absence of barking dogs, alarms or gunfire on that Christmas night, became the most unsettling detail of all. The dogs were trained to respond to movement, scent and fear. They were restless creatures, accustomed to patrolling boundaries, and reacting to anything unfamiliar. Even small disturbances usually set them off. A stray animal passing too close, a sudden movement in the dark, a nervous step taken too quickly, all of it typically drew attention. Yet that night, the kennels remained quiet, chains stayed slack, no howls rose into the cold air. For men who relied on those animals as extensions of their authority, the silence felt unnatural. Handlers later insisted the dogs had been fed well and secured properly. As always, some claimed the animals had been unusually calm, others that they had slept deeper than expected. None could explain why hundreds of unfamiliar movements passed through spaces normally guarded by scent and sound without triggering reaction. The possibility that the dogs had been deliberately avoided, their paths memorized, their sensitivities understood, forced an uncomfortable realization that observation had flowed both ways for years. Alarms were simple but effective on the plantation. Bells, horns, shouted calls, all designed to spread urgency quickly. They depended on early detection, on someone seeing something wrong and reacting immediately. That reaction never came. No bell rang, no warning cry echoed between cabins, no frantic signal cut through the holiday stillness. Either nothing was seen, or what was seen did not register as a threat. Both possibilities pointed to a failure not of equipment but of perception. Gunfire was the final assurance of control. A shot fired into the air was often enough to scatter fear across the ground. It was rarely used lightly, but its presence shaped behavior constantly. That no gun was fired meant no overseer felt threatened enough to reach for a weapon. No guard felt surprised, cornered or forced to assert dominance. Authority slept through the most significant breach of its power without ever being challenged directly. The absence of sound suggested timing chosen with precision, movements aligned with moments when guards were distracted, drowsy or absent. Routes were selected to avoid kennels, watch posts and open spaces where footsteps would carry. People moved when music, laughter or wind could mask the soft sounds of passage. Silence was not accidental, it was maintained deliberately, shared as a Those coordinating the escape understood sound as deeply as the plantation did. They knew how far a footstep could carry on frozen ground, how cloth muffled movement, how breath could betray presence. Children were instructed not to cry, not through fear but through preparation. Adults learned to slow their pace, to resist the instinct to rush, to accept that quiet movement mattered more than speed. The night became a test of collective restraint. Overseers later retraced patrol routes, listening as they walked, testing echoes, snapping twigs to gauge volume. They tried to convince themselves that noise must have been missed, that someone had failed to react quickly enough. But the truth remained that nothing had demanded reaction. The system had been bypassed so completely that its triggers never activated. The plantation had relied on sound as confirmation of order. Barking dogs meant boundaries were intact. Occasional shouted commands meant presence was felt. Gunfire, even when unused, meant fear was available instantly. That night removed all three without confrontation. Silence replaced authority, and authority did not know how to respond to silence. Rumors quickly followed. Some claimed the dogs had been poisoned, though no evidence supported it. Others suggested supernatural influence, a convenient explanation that avoided human agency. A few whispered that guards had been bribed or complicit, though no proof emerged. Each rumor served the same purpose, to explain away the possibility that 300 people had simply learned how to move quietly together. For the enslaved, silence had always been a survival skill. It meant enduring punishment without cry, working without complaint, grieving without ceremony. That skill, refined under oppression, was turned outward. The same silence that once protected them individually, now protected them collectively. It allowed them to pass through spaces designed to expose them, to cross boundaries guarded by noise rather than walls. The lack of barking dogs also meant no chase followed immediately, no pursuit tore through the night, no riders were mounted in urgent. By the time absence was discovered, hours had passed, distance had grown, and paths had cooled. Silence bought time, and time bought possibility. The plantation's greatest weapons were useless, once the moment for reaction slipped away. Officials later noted how unusual it was that even neighboring estates heard nothing. No alarm carried beyond property lines, no warning spread through the region until morning. Christmas celebrations elsewhere masked any faint sound that might have traveled. The escape blended into the larger quiet of the holiday night, unnoticed because nothing called attention to itself. Silence also shaped the psychological aftermath. Without noise there was no clear moment of failure to point to, no alarm missed, No shot fired too late. Responsibility became diffuse, harder to assign. Each overseer could claim nothing happened on their watch, because nothing had announced itself as happening at all. The system failed without drama, and that quiet failure lingered more deeply than any violent breach would have. The plantation remained haunted by that night, not by echoes but by their absence. Dogs barked again in the days that followed, but their sound no longer carried the same certainty. Bells rang, but they felt reactive rather than prevented. Guns were cleaned and displayed, yet they symbolized a power that had slept through its own undoing. In a place where noise had always enforced order, silence became the means by which order was escaped, leaving behind a landscape unchanged in appearance but fundamentally altered in meaning. A plantation that learned too late that the loudest challenge to authority can arrive without a sound at all.
When the sun finally rose, it revealed not violence but vacancy, and that realization struck the overseers with a force no uprising ever had. At first, confusion outweighed fear. Men moved from cabin to cabin assuming illness, delay, or some mistake in the morning count. Names were called out casually, then louder, then with irritation. The lack of response felt temporary at first, something that would resolve itself once authority reasserted its voice. It did not. Panic crept in slowly, not as shouting or running but as tightening expressions and hurried steps. Overseers began recounting numbers, comparing notes, retracing paths they had walked hundreds of times. Each check confirmed the same impossible truth. The quarters were empty. Fields lay untouched. Work crews did not assemble. The system that depended on bodies appearing at designated places collapsed at the most basic level. Orders were given hastily and then contradicted. One man sent riders toward the river while another insisted the forest be searched first. Some demanded the dogs be released immediately. Others argued it was already too late. The confidence that normally accompanied commands was gone, replaced by urgency and uncertainty. Authority fractured under pressure, revealing how much it relied on routine rather than adaptability. The overseer's panic was sharpened by fear of blame. Each man understood that losing control of even one enslaved person could end a career. Losing 300 threatened reputations, livelihoods, and possibly lives. Accusations surfaced quickly. Who had been on watch? Who had drunk too much? Who had skipped a patrol? Suspicion moved inward as fast as search parties moved outward. The plantation owner was summoned, his holiday shattered by the news. He arrived expecting disorder, perhaps evidence of rebellion that could be punished and explained away. What he found instead was an absence that offered no clear enemy to strike. His anger had no target. The people he ruled were gone, and nothing tangible remained to justify retaliation. Panic for him was not just emotional but economic. An entire workforce had vanished overnight, taking with it the wealth it generated. As news spread beyond the plantation, panic took on a wider shape. Neighboring estates tightened controls, fearing similar losses. Patrols increased. Dogs were unleashed more aggressively. Innocent movements were punished as preventative measures. The disappearance unsettled the entire region because it suggested that what had happened once could happen again, anywhere. Within the plantation, the panic revealed how dependent control had been on predictability. Overseers knew how to punish, how to threaten, how to coerce. They did not know how to respond to absence. There were no procedures for mass disappearance without struggle. Manuals of discipline offered no guidance. Authority flailed, improvising responses that felt inadequate even as they were enacted. Search efforts became frantic. Riders were sent in all directions, often duplicating one another's routes. Time was wasted arguing over theories rather than coordinating strategy. Some believed the escapees had hidden nearby, others that they had already crossed into distant territory. Panic undermined logic. Each hour that passed without discovery deepened the sense of failure. The enslaved who remained behind, those too young, too old, or too isolated to leave, watched the panic quietly. They saw the masks of certainty slip. They observed raised voices and frantic gestures where calm command had once ruled. For the first time, authority appeared vulnerable, reactive, rather than imposing. That image lodged itself deeply, altering perceptions in ways no punishment could undo. Officials arrived later, summoned to restore order and assign responsibility. Their presence intensified the panic rather than easing it. Questions multiplied, reports were demanded, explanations were scrutinized. Every overseer felt the pressure of accountability closing in. The disappearance became not just a failure of surveillance but a scandal that threatened careers and credibility. Rumors filled the gaps left by missing facts. Some claimed armed rebellion had occurred unseen. Others whispered of outside agitators, secret networks, or divine intervention. Each rumor was an attempt to make sense of panic, to give it shape. The truth, that discipline and planning had outmatched complacency, was harder to accept than any myth. The plantation owner issued orders meant to project control. New rules were announced, punishments were intensified, surveillance increased. But these measures felt performative, addressing fear, rather than solving the mystery. Panic had already revealed too much. It had shown that authority could be surprised, that systems could be bypassed, that certainty was fragile. As the day wore on, exhaustion joined panic. Men rode for hours without result. Dogs lost trails. Roads yielded nothing. The initial surge of frantic energy settled into a heavy dread. The realization set in that whatever chance there had been to recover control had likely passed in the night, stolen by silence and coordination. By evening, the plantation felt smaller, hollowed out by loss and uncertainty. Overseers moved more cautiously, speaking less, listening more, aware that the ground beneath their authority was no longer solid. Panic had not restored order. It had exposed the illusion of it, leaving behind a structure still standing but shaken at its core, haunted by the knowledge that power once taken for granted could vanish as completely and quietly as the people it failed to hold. Almost immediately after the disappearance was confirmed, speculation began to fill the vacuum left by missing fact. The scale of the escape felt too large, too precise, to accept as the work of those the plantation had long dismissed as incapable of coordination. Overseers and officials searched for explanations that preserved their belief in superiority. The idea that 300 enslaved people could plan and execute such a feat alone was deeply unsettling, so theories formed that placed agency elsewhere. Inside assistance became the most common assumption. Attention turned toward domestic workers, stable hands, and anyone who moved between spaces of power and labor, who had access to keys, who overheard schedules, who delivered food or laundry to the main house. Innocent routines were re-examined as potential conspiracy. A servant pausing too long in a doorway, a worker asking an unusual question weeks earlier. These moments were reinterpreted as signs of betrayal. Suspicion spread not because of evidence, but because it offered comfort to those who needed to believe the system itself had not been outsmarted. White employees were scrutinized as well. Overseers accused one another of negligence or complicity. Some insisted guards must have been bribed or threatened. Others argued that only an outsider with abolitionist ties could have organized something so complex. These claims often contradicted one another, but consistency mattered less than deflection. Blame had to land somewhere specific, anywhere other than on the assumptions that had governed the plantation for years. Long-term planning emerged as another theory, though it too was framed in ways that minimized enslaved intelligence. Officials suggested a hidden leader, someone unusually educated or influenced by outside ideas, had manipulated the rest. This allowed them to imagine the escape as the work of a single exceptional mind, rather than a collective effort. The possibility that planning could be shared, distributed, and sustained quietly across an entire community threatened the very logic of hierarchical control. Search parties looked for evidence of external contact. They examined roads for signs of wagons, questioned ferry operators, interrogated travelers. They wanted proof of coordination beyond the plantation's boundaries. When none appeared, frustration grew. The absence of evidence did not end speculation, it intensified it. Each unanswered question became justification for harsher interrogation of anyone still within reach. Religious explanations also surfaced. Some claimed the escape was divinely guided, a punishment for cruelty committed on a holy day. This theory, while seemingly irrational, served a purpose. It placed the event beyond human accountability. If God had intervened, then human systems could not reasonably be blamed. For deeply religious owners, this explanation offered a strange blend of fear and absolution. Others leaned into darker myths, whispering about secret signals, coded songs, or supernatural guidance passed down through generations. These ideas exoticized the enslaved rather than recognizing their discipline and strategy. Mystery was easier to accept than method. Legends replaced logistics. The escape became a story rather than a lesson. Officials commissioned reports, demanding timelines and reconstruction. Each document reflected the biases of its author. Some emphasized alleged outside agitators. Others focused on internal negligence. Few acknowledged the possibility that the enslaved had simply observed, learned, and waited. Language was carefully chosen to avoid granting too much credit. Words like manipulated, led astray, and influenced appeared frequently, reinforcing the belief that autonomy could not exist without external cause. Theories also shifted with time.
Early panic favored immediate explanations like bribery or drunken guard. As days passed without discoveries, ideas grew more elaborate. Some suggested the escapees had split into multiple groups, each guided by different helpers. Others believed they had been hidden locally and would surface once searches ended. Each theory reflected hope that control might yet be reasserted. For those left behind on the plantation, these speculations were observed quietly. They listened as authority debated itself, noting how rarely anyone spoke of shared planning among the enslaved. They saw how power struggled to imagine resistance that did not mirror its own structure. This reinforced a silent understanding that what had happened was being misunderstood deliberately. The focus on theories distracted from practical reflection. Instead of examining how surveillance had failed, how routine had created blind spots, energy was spent chasing imagined accomplices. This allowed the plantation to avoid confronting the uncomfortable truth that control had been predictable enough to be studied and navigated by those living under it. As weeks passed, theories hardened into official narrative. Records were written that emphasized external influence or extraordinary circumstances. These accounts shaped how the event would be remembered, reducing collective action to anomaly. By controlling the story, authorities hoped to control the lesson. Yet the persistence of unanswered questions undermined those narratives. No helper was caught, no mastermind identified, no secret network exposed. Theories accumulated without resolution, each one revealing more about the fears of those proposing them than about the reality of what occurred. The escape remained resistant to explanation because it did not fit existing categories. It was neither spontaneous rebellion nor externally organized rescue. It was patient, collective and internal. That reality lingered unspoke, challenging the plantation's worldview even as official theories tried to bury it under speculation, rumor, and denial, leaving behind a mystery that refused to resolve itself into anything comforting or familiar. Search efforts following the disappearance stretched far beyond the plantation itself, covering roads, forests, rivers and fields in a frantic attempt to recover what had vanished. Overseers and hired trackers moved with urgency, calling out names, scanning the ground for footprints, broken twigs or any sign of passage. Every familiar path was retraced, every clearing checked and every bend in the river examined. Yet the usual markers of flight, disrupted soil, hastily discarded items or evidence of struggle were either absent or so subtle as to be almost imperceptible. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed 300 people without leaving a trace. The woods surrounding the plantation had long been both a place of fear and of fascination. They offered cover for those who dared to run, but they were also known to contain predators, poisonous plants and difficult terrain. Search parties confident in their knowledge of the forest expected to find disruption. Footprints heading toward hidden clearings, branches bent low, signs of campfires or hurried rest. Instead, they found only the quiet of untouched wilderness. The undergrowth, pressed flat by countless years of wind and rain, showed no signs of recent disturbance. No deviation where someone might have moved stealthily. Tracks that were visible had been covered, masked or deliberately avoided, leaving searchers increasingly frustrated. Rivers were examined with equal diligence. Shallow crossings were inspected for broken reeds, displaced stones or the impression of bare feet. Banks were scoured for discarded belongings, attempts to cross hastily or signs of makeshift. Yet the water reflected only the sky, undisturbed and silent as if no one had passed. Each fruitless search deepened the panic and disbelief among overseers and neighbors. The natural boundaries they had relied upon for centuries had failed to reveal any clue. Paths leading away from the plantation were combed for wagon tracks or other indications of outside assistance. Farmers and travelers were questioned repeatedly, asked whether they had seen groups moving, whether they had noticed unusual activity during the night. Every answer was negative or inconclusive. Even when suspicion fell on nearby settlements, no corroboration emerged. The possibility that help had been rendered from outside remained hypothetical, supported only by the scale of the disappearance rather than by tangible evidence. The lack of discoverable trails suggested extraordinary discipline on the part of those who escaped. Movement had been deliberate, careful and coordinated, with individuals stepping where needed, and avoiding areas that would naturally reveal their passing. The absence of noise, footprints or broken undergrowth indicated meticulous planning. Each person knew their role, each step was calculated, and each choice minimized the risk of leaving evidence. What would normally have required years of tracking became a study in futility, because the escapees understood and manipulated the natural environment as fully as their human observers. Search parties tried to anticipate destination. Some assumed the escaped would head toward towns or plantations sympathetic to abolitionist causes. while others guessed that the river might be used to carry them downstream to distant communities. Scouts followed each potential route, examining terrain for clues. Each hypothesis, however, was undermined by the absence of corroborating evidence. They found nothing in the woods, nothing along the riverbanks, and nothing on the roads. The expected chaos of escape was nowhere to be seen, replaced instead by the quiet efficiency of carefully executed moves. Maps were drawn, plans revised, and repeated searches were undertaken, yet each attempt yielded minimal results. The scale of the disappearance made the task nearly impossible. 300 people could spread across multiple paths, fragmenting into smaller groups that were harder to track. Each subgroup could move independently, yet remain coordinated, leaving little trace beyond the initial point of departure. Searchers became disoriented, realizing that the absence of struggle extended well beyond the plantation itself. The surrounding community reacted in varying ways. Some neighbors sent their own men to assist, worried that the disappearance might inspire similar actions on their properties. Others locked doors and tightened controls, fearful that the same methods could be employed elsewhere. Communities oscillated between hope that the group might be captured or returned, and dread that such a coordinated disappearance exposed vulnerabilities in the established social order. Panic spread not just within the plantation but across the region. Even with the organized response, time worked against the searchers. Hours and days passed, and the faintest clues grew colder and less reliable. Fresh tracks could be erased by wind or rain. Discarded items might have been collected or hidden by those who had left. With each failure to find tangible evidence, confidence eroded. Overseers questioned themselves, doubted each other, and argued over strategy, revealing the limits of authority when confronted with ingenuity and patience. The search revealed more than just physical gaps. It exposed assumptions that the plantation had relied upon for years. Overseers believed that surveillance could always detect movement, that control was absolute, and that escape would inevitably be messy. The precision of the disappearance challenged these beliefs. It demonstrated that a system built on oversight and intimidation could be circumvented through discipline, shared knowledge, and coordinated timing. Every fruitless effort to track the escaped became a lesson in the limits of enforced control. Search parties eventually extended to distant areas, following rivers into neighboring counties and questioning farmers along the road. Guides were employed to interpret the land and speculate on possible routes, yet each extension of the search failed to yield result. The absence of struggle persisted. The absence of tracks remained, and the precision with which the escaped had moved continued to frustrate even the most experienced tracker. The longer the search continued without discovery, the more impossible the event seemed, amplifying both fear and admiration among those who pursued answers. The failure to find the group also had psychological effects on those conducting the search. Exhaustion, frustration, and disbelief eroded morale. Men who had relied on experience and intimidation as tools of authority found themselves powerless in the face of careful planning and discipline. Each day without progress reinforced the sense that something extraordinary had occurred, that the plantation and its surrounding network of control had been outmaneuvered not through force but through strategy. Every retraced path, every carefully scanned riverbank, every painstakingly examined clearing reinforced the same conclusion. The escapees had vanished not by chance but through intent. Their disappearance was deliberate, patient, and coordinated. The plantation, designed to enforce obedience and punish deviation, had been circumvented completely. Searchers could follow steps, retrace assumptions, and map theories, but the reality was that 300 people had left without leaving behind the chaos that authority expected, a fact that would haunt those charged with enforcing control for years to come.
By the end of the search, when every conceivable road had been scoured, when rivers had been followed for miles and forests combed repeatedly, the reality of what had occurred became undeniable. 300 people had vanished, leaving behind nothing but the empty cabins, abandoned chains, and stunned overseers who could no longer claim certainty over the lives they had once dictated. This absence was not merely physical, it carried with it a psychological weight that the plantation and surrounding region struggled to comprehend. For those in authority, it was a failure unlike any other, a collapse of control that revealed both the limits of power and the depth of human ingenuity. The scale of the disappearance meant that authority could not be restored through conventional means. Punishment, intimidation, and retaliation, all tools that had long enforced compliance, were useless because there were no targets. Each chain left behind was a reminder that coercion depended on bodies to act upon. Without people to restrain, punishment became abstract. Threats lost meaning. Orders could be shouted, but no one remained to hear them. The plantation, designed to produce labor and enforce submission, stood hollowed out by absence. The economic impact was immediate and severe. Fields went untended, crops were at risk, and daily labor that sustained both the plantation and its reputation disappeared overnight. Merchants and neighboring planters were forced to reconsider the reliability of their own systems of control. The disappearance revealed vulnerabilities that no one had fully appreciated, a demonstration that even meticulously enforced routines could be subverted with patience and planning. Wealth that depended on human labor now confronted the limits of coercion. The psychological ramifications extended beyond immediate loss. Overseers trained to expect obedience were forced to confront the reality that compliance could vanish without warning. Panic, previously an episodic response to rebellion or disorder, became a sustained state. Even days later, the memory of empty cabins haunted those responsible for maintaining authority. Trust in the established order eroded, replaced by suspicion, fear, and an acute awareness that predictability was no longer guaranteed. Neighboring plantations observed closely, trying to interpret what had happened. Some intensified surveillance, fearing similar coordinated departures among their own enslaved population. Others questioned the adequacy of their methods, realizing that traditional reliance on fear and routine could be insufficient. The event challenged entrenched assumptions about control, obedience, and the effectiveness of oversight. Stories spread quietly at first, then more openly, as the disappearance became both a cautionary tale and a source of anxiety. Everyone wanted to know how it had been accomplished, but few considered that the answer might simply be collective discipline and shared resolve. The narrative constructed by authorities focused on extraordinary explanations. They invoked outside agitators, secret societies, and divine intervention as mechanisms to account for the seemingly impossible. Each theory served to distance the event from the simple truth that a community under oppression had learned to observe, plan, and act together with precision. By attributing the disappearance to forces beyond the control of those who had been enslaved, authorities preserved the illusion that systemic power remained unassailable, even while it had been bypassed. In the aftermath, the plantation tried to restore normalcy, yet the shadow of absence lingered. Measures were taken to prevent recurrence, locks were reinforced, patrols intensified, dogs trained more aggressively, and overseers scrutinized for negligence. Yet these actions were reactive, responding to a crisis that had already passed. They could never fully erase the memory of competence displayed by those who had left. Authority had been challenged not by force but by strategy, and the lesson persisted despite attempts to suppress. Among the enslaved who remained, the disappearance of hundreds served as both inspiration and caution. Some mourned family members or friends lost to the unknown, while others absorbed the knowledge that collective action, patience, and discipline could yield freedom even under the strictest control. The event demonstrated that power is not absolute, that absence can be as powerful as presence, and that agency can survive even in environments designed to suppress it completely. Stories of the night circulated quietly, transmitted in whispered conversation and song, carrying both hope and practical lessons for survival. Overseers who had witnessed the aftermath were left to grapple with their own inadequacy. Years of experience, fear-based authority, and strict routines had been insufficient to prevent a disappearance that was methodical, silent, and intentional. Reflection often turned inward. Who had failed? What signals were missed? Which patterns of oversight were blind to human ingenuity? Yet self-examination could not undo what had been lost. The emptiness of the plantation, the presence of iron without bodies, and the quiet field stood as permanent reminders of that failure. Authorities also struggled with narrative control. How could an event of such magnitude be explained to other planters, to officials, to merchants, without admitting systemic vulnerability? Official accounts emphasized extraordinary circumstances rather than strategy, framing the disappearance as anomaly or divine act. By doing so, they attempted to neutralize the lesson inherent in the event, that human determination, discipline, and coordination could overcome even the most rigid systems of oppression. The event reverberated through the wider community, challenging assumptions about obedience, authority, and surveillance. Stories spread along trade routes, through neighboring estates, and into distant counties. Each retelling emphasized different elements: the scale of the disappearance, the absence of struggle, the abandoned chains, or the silence of the night. While some accounts sensationalized the event, others focused on practical lessons, highlighting the vulnerabilities exposed by reliance on routine and fear rather than understanding human behavior. Over time, the night became legend, both feared and admired. The plantation itself remained, structures intact, crops planted, fences mended, but it was fundamentally altered in meaning. What had been a site of absolute authority was now remembered as a site where control had failed spectacularly. The absence of those who had left carried a weight far beyond their physical departure, marking the limits of power and the enduring capacity for human ingenuity. The consequences for future management were immediate and long-lasting. Protocols were reviewed, chains were reinforced, and surveillance intensified, yet the awareness that the system could be outmaneuvered persisted. Officers and overseers who had been directly involved often suffered reputational damage,
their authority questioned even after measures were taken to restore order. They had learned, painfully, that predictability could be studied, patience exploited, and collective action rendered invisible until the moment of execution. The escape remained a silent testament to planning, discipline, and courage. It challenged prevailing notions of power, highlighting that control exists only as long as those under it allow it to function. When discipline, observation, and patience align, even the most rigid systems can be circumvented without violence, without confrontation, and without leaving the kinds of evidence authorities expect. The night revealed the limits of fear, the fragility of routine, and the possibility that freedom, when orchestrated with care, can emerge from even the strictest oppression. The story of the plantation where 300 people vanished is more than a tale of disappearance. It is a testament to the unbreakable human spirit. Every chain left behind, every cabin emptied without a struggle, every silent path through forests and rivers, speaks to courage, intelligence, and collective determination that could not be contained by iron, fear, or centuries of oppression. It is a reminder that power, no matter how absolute it seems, relies on consent, routine, and the obedience of those it seeks to dominate. When those bonds of control are studied, understood, and quietly resisted, even the most fortified systems can be the vanished souls left behind not only their chains but also a legacy, that freedom is not given, it is claimed, often in silence, with patience, precision, and unwavering resolve. Their absence echoes across history, a permanent testament to resilience, and the boundless human desire to be free.